everyone. Before we begin, I'd just like to thank the organisers and sponsors of Microsoft 365 May for having me. I'm based up in Sunshine Coast, Queensland, and we usually have to travel quite a lot in order to access this kind of opportunity. So a massive thank you to organisers and sponsors for making such an amazing virtual event possible. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters in which the organisers, speakers and participants are located, and pay deepest respects to all elders past, present and emerging. Particularly like to acknowledge the Kabi Kabi people of the land in which I reside. And also acknowledge the speakers and participants from New Zealand, and thank you for supporting this hui. And also draw attention to the Code of Conduct for Microsoft 365 May. You can view the full Code of Conduct on the website. It's fantastic to be given the opportunity to talk amongst our peers in an inclusive and non-discriminatory environment. It's free from harassment, regardless of how we express our beliefs and identities. So just ask all participants to review and follow the code to ensure a safe and welcoming environment. Be constructive, be respectful, be helpful, and be kind. And if you have any questions during the session, please ask them in the chat and I'm going to address them at the end. I'm going to try and jam a textbook's worth of content into just under an hour, but I'll definitely aim to leave some time for Q&A at the end. So just a bit of information about me to start with. My name is Rowena Keefe and I'm a digital workplace officer at the University of Sunshine Coast. My role is pretty diverse, but it mostly involves looking after the university's staff intranet, which is on SharePoint 2013, as well as collaboration sites, which are in SharePoint Online. The support, management and governance of SharePoint, it sits in information management services alongside functions such as records management and other information compliance and governance functions. Now, some of you might not be aware that universities are actually a public authority, which means we're bound by the same legislative requirements as the government. But at the same time, we're a university, so our core business is knowledge, and central to that is knowledge innovation. So on one hand, we must enable the business to create, to collaborate, to share, but we also need to have a pretty robust governance. So it's a complex balancing act, which is central to what I'm going to be talking about today. And this is me with my daughter. Over the last few weeks, like a lot of you, I've been working from home and my 6-year-old daughter has also been schooling from home, which has been a learning curve for me because most of my work is really complex and grey, but a 6-year-old needs things to be straightforward and simple. So when I started to work on this presentation, I was also learning with my daughter about shape sorting, recognizing patterns and predicting what comes next. For example, one of the objects in this slide is not like the others. So which of these objects does not belong? You guessed it, the chainsaw doesn't belong. At a really young age, we're trained to recognize patterns and sort objects, same, similar, and different. We're also taught to handle objects differently based upon this categorization. Do we put the chainsaw in the cutlery drawer? No. And before we answer why the chainsaw doesn't belong, I want everyone to think about your house. Your house is segmented into rooms or zones, and within those rooms and zones, you have containers to put stuff. Cupboards, bureaus, pantries, drawers, shelves, and on or in these containers, you might have more containers, boxes, compartments, dividers, bags. And each of these spaces, these containers, these segments serve a purpose. Now think about your kitchen. In your kitchen, you've got a cutlery drawer, and the cutlery drawer is segmented into spaces for knives, spoons, etc. Why is this a common arrangement? We collect things together because they fulfill a similar functional requirement. And why are they stored in the kitchen and not the bedroom? Because of the proximity to the work that's actually being done. The kitchen's purpose is to support the process of eating and drinking. So we bring things together into the kitchen that also support that process. So what's the point that I'm trying to make here? The way we arrange our objects should support the context of our needs and actions. Now, in the physical world, we have material properties that guide us. The chainsaw is way too big to fit in the cutlery drawer. It's sharp, dangerous, it stinks of oil and fuel. We use it outdoors. All the other tools are stored in the garage or shed. So we can use all of these material properties to help us choose where to put stuff. In the digital world, these properties are not as tangible, but the basic principle remains the same. The way we organize information should support what we need to do to get stuff done. And that's what this session's about. Information architecture is all about how we collect and arrange information. And while the focus is on SharePoint and Microsoft 365, it's not a technical deep dive. What I'm really interested in is the way we approach the design process and how we can better understand the business requirements in order to build an architecture that supports the needs and actions of the organization. And full disclosure, there are no right answers. You're going to get things wrong no matter what you implement. And why is that? Because information is complex, people are complex, behavior is complex. What works for one person, team, or organization might not work for another, and no single technology can cater to all business requirements and ways of working. So bear in mind that I'm speaking with the lens of my organization, but I believe the best approach is to aim for a flexible, scalable model that can be easily adapted and evolve with the business needs. So what is information architecture? It's a design approach that focuses on the structure and organization of information. It's user-centered, but not just the users of information as consumers, but also the creators and collaborators, as well as those who manage the platforms and governance. And it's not just today's users, but it's future users as well. There's an element of time that needs to be considered. How does information flow during the different stages of its life cycle? How can we arrange it so that it can be maintained? How can it be preserved and discovered for future us? So we look back at the purposes of information management. Information needs to be managed in a way that can be discovered at the time that it's needed. We don't want to have to ask someone to find something. We want to know where, or at least how to look for it. We want information to be shareable so that others can access it. And we need to enable a collaboration so that multiple people can work together to achieve a shared outcome. Information needs to be secure so we can protect information like valuable corporate IP, personal data, or financial records. And finally, we need to preserve the information, which is about maintaining its integrity, retaining access to it for the amount of time that we might need it. But all these things, discovery, sharing, collaboration, security, and preservation, are only a means to end. The reason we need effective information management is to make information useful so that employees can do their jobs. So how do we design the information architecture to support these IM goals? We look at the business. And I'm not going to go too much into the methods of user research out there because that's a presentation in itself. And if you're interested, Rebecca Rogers from Step 2 Designs is going to be presenting at Microsoft 365 May on user research this Thursday. But what I'm going to talk about is the kind of detail that we want to uncover. We want to know who the key stakeholders are and what activities do they do. What services do they offer? Who participates in each activity? Who needs to have visibility and who doesn't? How many employees are there? How diverse is that workforce? Do they need to collaborate externally and how often? Are their activities high risk and high value and thus produce critical corporate records? Do they work with vulnerable people such as minors? Do they manage sensitive information like medical records? How do they manage those records? We want to know how they manage and structure information currently, what they do well, what are their pain points? Is their information consolidated or sprawled across multiple systems? What kind of shadow IT do they have? What's their information culture? Is it heavily enforced by management or is it every employee for themselves? Do they have consistent approaches, naming conventions, and how much content do they have? And so on. The information we find out during the user research phase is really important to the structural design. And it's even better if the users are involved in collecting this information themselves. We don't always have to be the ones who are facilitating the discovery. So to explore this process a bit, I'm going to introduce a case study from my organisation. I'll talk about this a bit today. Over the last couple of years at USC, we've been working with a department called CSALT, which is the Centre for Support and Advancement of Learning and Teaching, to move from file shares and email into SharePoint Online. At the same time, we've done a lot of work updating the intranet content and structure. So when we initiated the engagement, CSALT were making changes to their service model, or re-engineering a whole lot of processes, so it was an absolute no-brainer to also shift the way that they manage their information. Luckily for us, they'd already begun the discovery phase, actively collecting information about their stakeholders, their activities, and their information. Their priority was clear: improve their ability to provide a service at scale. To achieve this, there were a few key focuses, including the development and improvement of self-service resources, enhanced professional learning, i.e. workshops, training, and staff development, collaboration and transparency, and not just within the department, but across the whole university, and a more holistic approach to service delivery. The discovery phase, which consisted of a whole bunch of user research activities such as process mapping, brainstorming, statistics gathering, showed that not all work areas within the department wanted or needed the same level of change, and not all activities had the same structural or compliance requirements. For example, there were several high-risk activities identified, and they were being managed in records management tools. So now we started collecting the information. What do we actually do with it? We create resources that paint a picture of the business. Now, there are a few reasons to do this. We want to ensure that the structure is based upon evidence. We need things that we can test solutions against. And we also need a defense in case the stakeholders disagree. For example, we can describe the stakeholders by breaking down the different stakeholder groups into personas. Personas enable us to develop solutions that solve problems and work for the users. We can test against the personas. Does the structure, for example, address the pain points and achieve the priority goals? For example, Barry here, who's an academic developer, his pain points information silos. So we've got to ensure that the structure makes it easier to share across teams. We can also use statistics. For example, in the process of moving an area from a file share to SharePoint, we want the new structure to cater to the current and future work practices, not a whole bunch of legacy files. So in the chart here, we can see 53% of files were created beyond 2 years ago. And it shows the age of the files before the migration. And we can use this as a cogent argument against a straight lift and shift migration. We can create process maps. For complex processes, particularly those with structured data, we might want to create whiz-bang diagrams like this. Now, in case you're wondering, it's been intentionally blurred. The data is actually confidential, but the detail is not important. Basically, if you've got a whole lot of moving parts, it's worth getting a skilled BA to map out the process. But the process diagram doesn't actually have to be complex. In the sea salt case study, the delivery of workshops and other events was identified as one of the key activities. This really simple process diagram breaks down the activity of the event planning into 3 key stages: pre-event, event delivery, and post-event. The diagram shows the different tasks that make up the activity across the life cycle. We can also start identifying activity outputs, and this table shows some of the key outputs that are produced during the activity I spoke about before. And this table expands on the previous table to outline the access requirements for each of those output types. And then this table maps out the records requirements for each of these activities. For example, the items marked in red, they need to be captured and retained in a records management system, whereas the items marked in yellow and blue are considered transitory or short-term records. And in terms of legislative obligations, these records only need to be retained until the business action is completed. For sea salt, the items marked in blue might be useful to retain for ongoing business use, whereas the items marked in yellow are only meaningful for the purposes of each event, and they can be cleaned up at the end to make for a nicer space. So hopefully you can see why we're starting to paint a picture of the business activities and related outputs, and this picture can be used to inform the IA as we move forward. Well, once we've understood more about the business and collected as much information as we can about the information and activities, it's time to start sorting and categorizing into logical groupings. We want to categorize information in a way that makes information useful in the context of its use, which means looking at the data we've collected and we start mapping the information to the process. So we've touched on this with earlier slides. We took an activity, events, and broke it down into phases, topics, access requirements, and records requirements. But now we're going to look a little bit deeper. I'm going to share with you a diagram I call the control spectrum. If you think back to the key purposes of information management we spoke about earlier, we've got discovery, sharing, collaboration, security, and preservation. Achieving these goals requires a balancing act between enablement and governance. Governance too tight, people are going to rebel, and this is where shadow IT happens. If the governance too loose, people get confused. People will have the freedom to create, but it results in chaos and confusion, a lack of trust, and not to mention security breaches, data loss, and legislative non-compliance. This control spectrum can be used to identify how much governance is required depending on the nature of the activity and the information that we're managing. Is the activity ongoing or temporary? Do we have to emphasize trust and preservation, or is it more about innovation and creativity? Is the content high risk or low risk? Do we need enhanced security, or are we aiming for visibility to expose the information to as many people as possible? Are we pushing the information? Is it monodirectional, or do we need collaboration and have back and forth? And finally, is the information structured or unstructured? So if we look back at the process flow of a workshop resource, during the first phase, drafting, the emphasis is on creativity and innovation. This document is not source of truth for anyone but the contributors, so it's low trust, low risk, and it only needs to be exposed to the contributors to be able to work on it. In the second phase, event delivery, the emphasis is on portability and change control. We don't have much creativity here, but we need to have high trust because the presenter needs to know that it's going to be the right version and the accurate version when they get up to present in front of a room full of people. And then in the final phase, the resources need to be shared and preserved so they have continued use. They need to have quality and change control and structured so that they're easily discoverable. So we can see that the control requirements, the level of governance required, is different per phase of activity. And this has a big impact on the way that we want to sort the content. So here's my proposition. It's easiest to get that balance of governance and enablement if we structure information in a way that clusters together activities and information with similar control requirements. The broader the set of stakeholders' information, the more restrictive the controls need to be to satisfy the security and compliance obligations of the things that need the most governance. But if we group information with similar control requirements, we can start relaxing the controls on some content and enforce more rigor on others. To illustrate, let's go back to our kitchen analogy. Let's say we have children in the house, which I do. We might not want to block them from the kitchen entirely. We want to encourage self-sufficiency. But we might separate the sharp knives from the butter knives so we can avoid injury. Or if we want to protect our grandmother's precious china, we might put it into a different cabinet. And we just take a little pause here. We have a competition running for Microsoft 365 May. Registered participants can scan this QR code, enter the prize draw. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds to quickly scan this if you want to enter into the prize. Okay, so now we've done some user research, presented the business and their needs in a way that can inform the design. We've sorted and categorized the information by activity, output, and access requirements. Now we need to design the structure. This is where we need to understand the technology and what kinds of capability it offers. So what Microsoft 365 functionality can we use to organize our information? So there's a lot of Microsoft tools we can use to structure information that I'm not going to talk about today just because of the amount of time we have. And bear in mind, I've got a SharePoint lens. So it's the prime repository of enterprise content in Microsoft 365. So the scope of this section is largely going to be focused on SharePoint with a little bit about Teams, but there are other places that you can put information in Microsoft 365. So there are two key approaches to SharePoint architecture. We have flat or hierarchical. Now, if we think back to traditional file shares, the containers are all folders. You start off with a set of folders under which nests more folders in a really hierarchical fashion. To access information, you have to follow a branching structure. SharePoint used to replicate this. You had a farm. Inside the farm were site collections. Inside the site collections, subsites. Inside subsites were document libraries. Inside document libraries, folders, like the nesting dolls I show up there. And these days, Microsoft actually advocates for a flat architecture. We go wide, not deep, and simulate hierarchy if necessary, using navigation tools. But why a flat architecture? Because organizational structure, business activities, and information needs change frequently. And if you've ever had to extract layers of nested content, it's a really time-consuming, arduous process. And more often than not, people don't have the time to actually do this. So they do one of two things. They keep working in legacy structures that don't support their new ways of working. This leads to inefficiencies. or a lot of the time they create a new location and then just leave the legacy stuff sitting there just in case. This leads to information risks, including information sprawl, duplication, loss of corporate data, and again, inefficiency. With a flat architecture, you still have a lot of containers, but we aim for breadth rather than depth, which makes it easier to rearrange the content if the business needs change. So how does this work? Let's have a closer look. To store information, we need containers. So containers serve a couple of key functions. They're a place to store data. We can arrange them to provide structure. They define access. They limit the scope of discovery by a specific context. What type of containers do we have in SharePoint and Microsoft 365? We can start at the broadest level, sites. There are a lot of different types of sites for different purposes. The first level of classification is done by Microsoft. So we have the home or root site. We've got hub sites. Under that, team sites, communication sites. Sits within that, we've got libraries and folders. Now, home sites, they're tenant level sites and they haven't been released at our organisation. They definitely need to be considered in this structure. But we've currently got a root site collection which serves a similar purpose. It's an entry point, a front door to SharePoint, a way to access the various content within. We've got team sites. Team sites are designed for active work and collaboration. They can be standalone or connected to a Microsoft team. They're technically really flexible and scalable. And while you could run your entire organization out of one, it's not something I'd recommend. If your organization uses Teams, it's likely that a lot of your team sites actually have a team over the top. While the SharePoint site behind each team is technically the same as a standalone team, it actually changes the way we approach information architecture. I'm going to go into this in a bit. Next, we have communication sites, which are designed for publishing and distributing content. At USC, we're in the middle of a proof of concept to migrate our intranet from SharePoint 2013 to communication sites. Finally, we have hub sites, which are really important as they tie a whole bunch of connected sites together while still enabling a flat architecture. With hubs, you can apply a consistent look and feel and menu across all connected sites, but most importantly for our architecture, you can search across all connected sites and roll up activity and documents and news and events. Better yet, you can plug and unplug sites from hubs. So when organizational structure changes, your information architecture can change too. The only downside is that sites can only belong to one hub, so it still creates a little bit of a hierarchy in that process. So what can you use hub sites for? At USC, we've got a projects hub, which enables enterprise visibility and transparency over enterprise projects. We've got business unit hubs that tie together a whole bunch of business areas operations. We'll be using a hub to tie our communication sites together for the intranet. We can also use hubs to break down organizational silos and bring together a whole bunch of cross-functional processes and services. Now, out of the box, this is where site categorization stops, but at USC, we manage the provisioning of process of sites and teams to assign metadata to sites outlining the kind of activity that they're supposed to manage. So we've got project sites, community practice sites, operational sites for ongoing operational activities or processes. We've got intranet sites, hub site, and home site. We've also got custom site categories, which further delineates the purpose of the site. For example, we can outline whether a site is for an IT project or a capital works project. This classification lets us do 5 things. First up, we have governance. We can define the level of control required by the site type. For example, we enable self-provisioning for self-contained activities, but we locked down operational sites because there's a whole lot of complexity and risk involved. Support and management of the sites. When we get a support request, we can tell at a glance what the purpose of the context of the site is without needing to ask. Enhanced discovery. We can use metadata-driven roll-ups to provide access to sites by the type of activity. And reporting. We can report on how the sites are being used. For example, I can see that more people use SharePoint for projects than any other activity. And finally, we have structure. We can use it to guide users to the right solution for their business needs. So we've defined these categories, but how can we help users choose the site or combination sites that they need to manage their information? We go back to the business activities and control requirements, ask the following questions. Is it a project, community, or community of practice? Do they need to collaborate, or is it about distributing content? Who needs to be involved? Is it a select number of named users, a single work area, entire business unit, or employees from multiple business units? And where do all the activities sit on the control spectrum? If the activity is a project, a committee, or community of practice, for us it's really easy. These activities are clearly defined in the governance, so it's just a matter of assigning access, so we know the best hub to connect it to. For example, an operational project within a single business unit can be connected to a business unit hub, whereas something that's cross-functional might need to have access by more people. For ongoing activities, we just need to define the purpose and access. Enterprise communication and distribution of content, that's going to be an intranet. Comms and content distribution for just a single business unit, that would go into the business unit hub. So the end result for a business unit could look something like this, where we have a business unit hub with a whole bunch of connected sites that are specific to that one area. And then we've got a whole lot of cross-functional activities that can also be accessed, and they roll up for visibility on an enterprise level. So as you can probably tell, I'm a big fan of flat architecture, but there are definitely some pros and cons to this model. The biggest con is that it can be a really hard sell, both to your steering bodies and your users. And I'm not going to lie, moving laterally through information can be a little confusing if you're used to a hierarchical model. So it requires change management to achieve the benefits. And sometimes in my organization, I don't win this battle, and we still end up with organizational structural sites and hierarchical models. But whether or not you go with a flat modular architecture or traditional hierarchy, there's still more we can do to get the structure working for the users. So designing site structure is all about segmentation. It's how we break the information into parts to make it easier to manage and make the content easier to find. So how do you go about designing the site structure? It's heavily dependent on the choices you've made in the previous step. So the broader and more complex the information that will be placed in a site, the more detailed the structured the segmentation needs to be. But if you have a focused range of information and participants, you can probably get away with less structure. A team, a few channels, and that's all you'll need. But let's just say you have a whole lot of cross-functional information to manage or large volumes of structured information. You might want to delve a bit deeper. There are almost infinite ways to approach the structure of a SharePoint site, but how to approach this depends on some of the following. The volume and diversity of the information and activities. If you've clustered your information together with similar profiles, then the site structure can be quite simple. But if you've got diverse requirements, then you're going to have to think more and put more rigor into controlling the different categories. How structured is the information? Structured data with repeatable patterns, such as reporting on financial documents, can be treated differently to activities with lots of diverse and creative outputs. Information literacy and behaviours of the owners and members. So we could create the most amazing site with bells and whistles, but if the owners and members don't understand it or don't have the time to maintain it, then it's useless. It will just end up being a whole bunch of wasted effort. And if the site's connected to a Microsoft team, the file management is then determined by the channel structure, which I'm going to go into a little bit more. If you're designing information architecture of a site with a connected team, it's really important to understand how they work together. So I'm going to assume everyone listening has at least a basic understanding of Microsoft Teams and how it works, but I'll reiterate a couple of points, basically on how Teams impacts file management in SharePoint. So first up, every team is connected to a SharePoint site, and file management for that team is managed by SharePoint. If you're in the chat, it's OneDrive, but when we're talking about a team, it's all SharePoint. The team uses the out-of-the-box shared documents library to manage files. So even if you wanted to, you can't customize this and connect together any other document libraries. If you rename the channel, it doesn't rename the folder. You also can't merge channels, although you can migrate files between channels. Channel folders can be accessed by the Files tab in each channel. This brings through metadata and views from SharePoint, but doesn't allow you to edit file properties. And this might have an impact if you'd want to decide to introduce more complex metadata later in the stage. And you can connect together other document libraries of tabs. So if you have other document libraries in your SharePoint site and you want to bring that through to Teams, you can, but there are a few limitations about how it integrates with the app. For example, you can't have a file tab with associated conversations, which was one of the most valuable things in Teams, is to be able to have contextual communication down the side while you're working on a file. And if you upload a file to the channel conversation, it loads it into the channel folder. So if you're deciding to use another document library as your source of truth, then you can create confusion as to where you're going to put things. So there's also some other considerations such as access. Teams access is all or nothing. So you're either an owner or a member. You can give non-members access to content in SharePoint without giving them access to Teams. SharePoint permissions are still really customizable, but if you're in the team, you're in the team, and if you're not in the team, you're not in the team. If you need to restrict access to certain team members, you can go and create a private channel, but this creates an entirely new site and should be used with discretion. And finally, you design your channel structure for interaction, not in the same way that you might if it's just a document library. It's like setting a meeting. Ask, what do we need to work on together, and base your structure and membership on that. So how do we structure SharePoint and Teams to suit business needs? Again, we're going to go back to the questions that we asked earlier. What's the volume and diversity of the activities and information? What's the level of control required for each? How structured is the information? And what are the information behaviours and digital literacy of the owners and members? We can take an example of a small project team, let's call it Fun Project. They're carrying out a defined set of activities with a focus scope, high collaboration needs, and we don't want to restrict their creative output. We want to give them the flexibility to evolve the space to suit their needs. So they create a team. We might provide a template with a couple of predefined channels, but the rest is up to them. The mantra for the majority of their content is innovation. They need to be able to create, plan, draft, experiment, and even delete content during the initiation and planning phases, not impose over-the-top restrictions in the way that they do this. Access will be limited to the project team and maybe a couple of key stakeholders. But let's say they want to provide access to project outputs to employees outside the team. We might create a channel called Project Outputs and adjust the permissions of the folder in SharePoint so that it can be accessed by a broader group of people. The project team will move official project outputs into the channel folder, or apply a retention label so important outputs are preserved and protected. And then the mantra of this folder is trust. The SharePoint site connected to their team is assigned to a projects hub. This means that others in the organisation can access their outputs, not their drafting documents. And this provides visibility and access to trusted, quality controlled information. Now, let's say the project manager and sponsor also need to manage sensitive financial information that they want to restrict down to a couple of members of the team. They have a few options. They might create a second document library called confidential documents and restrict the access to a specific permissions group. Or if they need to communicate alongside these sensitive documents, they might create a private channel. Now, example number 2, let's go back to the sea salt case study we spoke about earlier. We know the last thing we want to do is jam 50 people into a single site. So we've broken up the group into various sites, including projects, ongoing operations, cross-functional processes, and intranet content. We've also created a sea salt hub site to bring it all together. How can we further segment each activity? This is the sea salt events activity we looked at earlier. We've decided the content for this activity can be managed in 3 different spaces. So first we have the sea salt event site, which is a cross-functional site and manages the event planning, evaluation, and event records. It's facilitated by a core admin team, but also contributed to by various workshop facilitators, visible to everyone in the department, maybe even visible to other areas like events and catering. We might have a couple of locked down sections in that site, however. We want to lock down, say, the feedback forms and evaluation reports that might contain some sensitive information about how people feel about the events. The content in this particular site is highly structured, methodical, predictable, and repeatable. Now, each presenter is also part of an operational site for their work area, because this is where they do their day-to-day activities, and it makes sense to draft their presentations and resources in their own working space where they're doing all of their other work. Their workshops are rarely one-off, so they will maintain a master working version and move the final versions of each workshop artifacts into the intranet. Which brings us to end users, the clients of these workshops. Employees need ongoing access to the resources delivered at each workshop, so we might keep a structured history of the presentations on the staff intranet. So we maintain access to the event resources in the staff development and training site, which is an intranet site and provides consistent centralized access to all staff development activities across the organisation. So each of these spaces serves a different purpose, provides different levels of control to suit the context. And in each of these examples I just provided, the content fits into one or more of these categories. We've got working documents, records, sharing, or confidential documents. Activities and outputs that are highly structured and predictable with low levels of innovation or variance to the content and access can probably live and die in the one location. One library could manage the drafts, the records, and the sharing all in one. However, activities with a lot of diverse or unpredictable content and access might need to embrace that information can move from multiple locations. So it might need 3, 4 locations depending on the stage of its life cycle. Now we've allocated our activity as an information center sites, and we've started to work out how we might break down the content into different libraries, folders, and channels. We've also established that if the focus of the site is narrow, we might not need to do much else, but what if additional structures required? Sometimes we can achieve this. We can just create nested folders, and to be honest, sometimes that's all business areas will want or need. But if we want to get clever, SharePoint and Microsoft 365 provides a lot of additional functionality that helps us to intelligently structure and organize the data, as well as control its behavior. We've got column metadata, views, content types, document sets, retention, security labels, DLP, workflow rules, and so on. And we can even ditch the files and start working in lists, Power Apps, and Power BI. But the simplest and most accessible way to start structuring information like this is metadata. Metadata is data about data. The most obvious example of this is site list and library columns. There are a bunch of different columns you can add, such as simple ones like free text, date, time, people, hyperlinks, pictures, and choice fields. Or you can get quite complex and you have lookups that reference data in other lists, calculated columns that use an Excel-like function to be able to modify the data, and managed metadata, which retrieves centrally stored enterprise vocabularies from the term store. For example, in your document library settings, you can automatically set more metadata by folder, or you can create content types, which you use to define templates and column values for structured information. I'm not going to go too much into content types as Russ Norton's going to be presenting on them later today for Microsoft 365 May. And if you're interested in content types, I'd really encourage you to go to that. But they offer so much opportunity for efficiencies when you're dealing with repetitive structured information at scale. There are also document sets which groups together a bunch of structured templates with automatically applied column values. So let's say you have a repetitive activity that requires a consistent set of outputs for each iteration. You can create them all with a click of a button. Our caveat for these content types and document sets, they can be finicky and time consuming to set up. So the efficiency gains are only worth it if there's a specific need. They're definitely a solution to have on hand if the need arises. There are many benefits to using metadata to structure your content. For me, the biggest advantage is that it decouples the information from its container and allows content to surface in more than one place at once. Ever spent minutes trying to pick which folder to save a document into? Metadata allows it to exist in multiple categories at once. It's data-driven, great for large volumes of content, can also drive workflow and auto-classification. Now, I'm a really big fan of metadata, but whether it works or not definitely depends on the context. So at USC and our intranet, we have a single document library. It's got about 2,500 documents, and it's all structured by metadata, no folders. Everyone pulls the information into the same place, no pockets, no silos, no navigating through nested folders. If you want to know what documents are managed by a particular business unit or a particular person, we just filter it. And if we want to know what a page of documents associated with it, we just filter. When we first launched SharePoint Online, I pushed metadata and even went as far as removing the ability to create folders in our site templates, which was a huge mistake because only about 10% of people embraced it. The rest really struggled. So we loosened up a lot about that. If you want to categorize your folder, you can do so. But probably the best use case of metadata that we've implemented at USC is our statistical information and analysis unit, who have to provide access to thousands of student surveys every study period. They run a script to update the file names of each file and then use calculated columns to pull the relevant data into columns, term code, course, year, etc. They upload, they drag into the library, and then the metadata is automatically populated, which allows them to filter and refine that data as needs. Now, I've spoken a lot about governance and records in this session, and at USC, we are in really early stages of exploring the functionality available in the Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance Centers. I'm not going to go too deep on this today as I cannot profess any kind of expertise at all, but I wanted to touch on the role that data classification can play in your information architecture. Data classification offers a really exciting way to decouple your structure from the ability to preserve and secure your content. In traditional information management, if you want to secure sensitive information, you have to move it and put it into a container to restrict the access. Or if you want to define the retention on the document, you have to put it into a specific location. Using security and compliance features like DLP, sensitivity and retention labels, you've got more control over the security and preservation, but you can also relax a little bit about how it's enforced. For example, you can apply attention labels based upon path, folder, or metadata, and enable decentralized records management while still maintaining central visibility and control over the records. We still need to pay attention to the structure and organization of the content where it lives, but it allows for a little bit more flexibility in this design. Now I'm going to pause again so you can look at this competition code. Encourage everyone to enter. And now we've gotten to the final part of this presentation, which is about discovery. Now we've sorted the information, we've put it into containers, we've refined the structure using meta functionality, and now we have to help users actually locate the information. So in reality, we should be designing for discovery from the get-go. And this step's by no means the final one in a sequential process. We kind of want to go in a bit of a cycle when we're starting to design information architecture, and discovery needs to be thought about right at the beginning. We definitely need to go in to design the user experience of how they get from point A to point B. So what are the things that we can use in SharePoint and Microsoft 365 to aid in that journey? First up, we have labels, and I don't mean data classification labels that I was just speaking about. I'm talking about plain old words. If you're going to choose one thing to improve information architecture, it would be to get your words right. Meaningful words drive search, they drive navigation, they describe the content that you're looking at. Meaningful words disambiguate, which means they help us know the difference between information assets. And meaningful is the key here. Needs to make sense to the creators and consumers of the content, and not just now, but in the future or when the content is actually extracted from its context. Get your words wrong and no amount of technical wizardry is going to save you. File names, titles, descriptions, classification schemes, menus, content text, metadata, container names, every other architectural choice is made or broken by how it is labeled. For example, search. People want a search that works like Google. If you've heard this one before, and here's another one, information architecture is dead. People just need good search. And it's true, a lot of statistics support the idea that the majority of discovery happens in search. And if you're interested in this, I would check out Robert Crane's presentation later on today. In his session, it's all about search. But get the most amazing Google-like search at your organization with incredible algorithms, and a bad IA will still spoil the party. So what can lead to bad search and how can good information architecture help? First and most importantly, if the label isn't meaningful, you won't be able to search for it. So use meaningful page, site, and file names. You can't find content in search if you don't have access to it. Access is rarely just a permissions issue, it's a structural issue. Design your architecture with access in mind to ensure that its content is discoverable by those who need it. And on the topic of access, design for exclusion. Too many choices is as bad as too few. Design structures that allow users to limit their search by access, context, or metadata. And finally, nothing clouds search results like a bunch of outdated, inaccurate, or duplicate content. And while information architecture doesn't fix sloppy behavior, it can help in the same way that a really well-designed kitchen can help you keep your kitchen clean. It just makes it easier to do the right thing. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some really cool search configuration that you can do in Office 365 that you can use to enhance discovery, but you can still get search right even if you never touch the search settings. The point in this is design the architecture to support the search. Don't design your search to fix poor architecture. Another key discovery tool is navigation, and the most commonly known digital navigation tool is the menu. At our staff intranet at USC, we have a really straightforward hierarchical menu system controlled by a single managed metadata set in the term store. We have 8 global navigation items. They branch hierarchically into about 1,200 pages. Each page has a local navigation on the left. It shows sibling pages and a flyout menu to child pages. This navigation is also presented via breadcrumbs at the top of the page. It's a great structure because it enforces relationship between content items and presents a somewhat linear path to content. But from our observation, testing, and analytics, a really small portion of staff actually follow the navigation in a linear path. Users mostly journey through the content itself, contextual in-content navigation, tiles, in-text links. They scan for relevant words, and they either read or they jump off as required. Now, this is not to say the menu isn't essential, but I'd say the biggest value it actually plays administratively. Provides us logic and structure the content to track and maintain order and control. But as USC moves into SharePoint Online, we probably won't take the same approach. And why is that? Because we want a flexible, scalable, and dynamic information ecosystem. So our intranet on-premise is really controlled. We don't want to maintain that same level of rigor when we move online. And it's not to say that menus aren't going to have a place in SharePoint Online. Team sites have a local navigation on the left menu. Communication sites have beautiful mega menus, and there's the hub site menu to provide consistency across connected sites. But how do we even know that users are going to be navigating via SharePoint Online? There are so many ways that users can access content in Microsoft 365. For example, there's the SharePoint tenant home, or they could land directly into a hub site. Or maybe they use mobile apps. Maybe they've got the page bookmarked in their browser. They go straight to office.com, their favorite app via the app launcher. Or maybe they're not a fan of the browser and mostly they just sync content using File Explorer or open documents via desktop apps. Or they use Microsoft Search via the Start menu. Maybe they go straight to OneDrive, use Delve, or have everything integrated into their team. There are so many entry points to information. It just shakes up the idea of navigation. So all users will not have the same journey. This doesn't negate the requirement for navigation. It just drives us to think about the way it works. Again, we aim for flexible and scalable structure that provides multiple ways for users to find where they're going. So key discovery solution lies in the design of content itself. The way in which content is structured enables users to interact with and navigate content in different ways. And it decouples the content from structure and provides different context-rich paths to information. So let's consider some of the following formats in Office 365. We've got pages, we've got web parts. It's often surfacing dynamic content from other locations. These pages can be added into Teams, but it removes the navigation. There's an incredibly rich graph API that hooks into just about everything to enable access to content through search and delve and web parts and custom apps. We've got lists which can be interacted with directly or used to drive web parts or Power Apps or other SharePoint apps like calendars and tasks. There are standalone apps like Power Apps and all the other Power Platform, Stream, and these can be integrated into SharePoint or embedded into Teams tabs. And then there's third-party services or custom apps that integrate with your line of business systems for visibility and interaction inside SharePoint and Teams. And then we've got good old-fashioned files. So the path to information in Microsoft 365 shouldn't be limited to a linear hierarchical journey. It's got to be rich and interconnected and contextual. And we know this is where Microsoft's heading. If you haven't already, go look up Project Cortex. I'm not exactly sure what role Project Cortex is going to play in our information architecture, but I don't know enough to speak about it today, but I'm certain it's going to shake up our understanding and change the way we look at this structure. Which brings us into the final point. What role does information architecture play in discovery? So it's everything that I've spoken about today. Employees navigate via content. So structure and cluster content with relevant information so that the people who need it have access. We use meaningful labels so that people know where they are and what they're clicking on. We design good content with the target audience in mind, with visual cues so that they know where they need to go next. We make content dynamic where possible, choose formats that enable information to be surfaced in multiple locations, and rich metadata so that information can be filtered and refined and displayed in different ways depending on the information need. We know that employees navigate via Teams channels and tabs, so we've got to consider how different content can be brought in and integrated into Teams. And as Microsoft says, SharePoint and Teams is better together. And we can design menu systems that help orient people when they're in SharePoint in the browser. And finally, we design for search. So in summary, today we've run through how we can understand and describe the business needs, cluster information together by activity outputs and control requirements, getting the right combination of sites to suit the activities, breaking down and segmenting each of those sites in a way that makes sense to the business, and finally designing for discovery. And remember, the main thing we're aiming to do is make information useful. So it doesn't matter exactly which approach you take as long as it's the right one for your business. And thank you. Does we have any questions today? It looks like we don't have any questions. So if that's it, we might be able to finish today. Thank you for everyone for joining us. And if you do have any, following thoughts, I can be contactable, email, catch me on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you very much, everyone.